So, King Josiah was killed, and you have to get a sense of what an impact that was. Here was this young king doing this tremendous religious revolution, returning the covenant, recapturing the north, like a new David, the one who's rated no king like him before him or after. And then he dies by the age of 40, and it all comes apart. And things are terrible after that. After that, 3 of his sons and 1 of his grandsons will be king after him, and it just keeps getting worse and worse. For those of us who lived through the Kennedy years, I kind of imagine it something similar to that. Kennedy was the youngest president elected and was this charismatic figure who then dies in this horrible way, young. And people, when they talk about it, when you watch news things, even if you didn't live through it, they talk about how it was like the nation was in shock at the time and all. And this famous thing that everybody remembers where they were when they heard about it. I do. And I think it could have been something like that with Josiah. There were probably a certain number of people who breathed a sigh of relief when he was killed. They probably said, they didn't like all his religious reforms. There had to be a certain number who weren't crazy about him. Some of the highest priests probably weren't crazy about him. There was political change in the priesthood, we'll see. And so it was just an extraordinary moment in history. Sometimes when a leader dies, it doesn't really change the course of a nation. And in other cases, it does. And in his case, it did. And so just take notice of that. The strange thing is, remember when they got the prophecy of this prophetess Huldah? She said, yes, some terrible things are coming and a big destruction and all, but the king is going to go to his grave in peace. And you go, well, he had an Egyptian arrow in his heart. Is that exactly what you mean by going to your grave in peace? And some say, well, no, it meant he was going to go to his grave still in peacetime. He wasn't going to live to see all these terrible things that would happen to the country. And then others say, no, that prophecy of Huldah was put in the text, and then it turned out it didn't work out that way, but they left the prophecy in there anyway, and a different person was writing the end, and so make it an issue of authorship of the history. Or there are those who could just admit that her prophecy didn't actually come true the way she gave it. And now that troubles some people, especially if you have a belief in the Bible where you believe in biblical prophecy as really coming from God. The interesting thing about that to me was my great colleague David Noel Friedman of blessed memory. He would always point out that a certain number of the prophecies in the Bible don't come true. There are a few where the prophet visibly gets it wrong. And most of the time, the prophecies are right. And he said the fact that there's some prophecies that don't come true, that are wrong in the Bible, makes the whole thing believable. If absolutely every prophecy in the Bible came true, then afterwards people like now would look at it and they'd say, well, sure, because you're just making it up. You wait until you see what happens, and then you're right, oh yeah, Jones the prophet said it was going to happen that way. They would be suspect. But the fact that the Bible includes the prophecies that didn't come true means those who collected the Bible and kept books in there were seriously trying to report it the way it happened. And that might be the case too. So there you have 3 different explanations of Huldah's prophecy. Take what you want. The guy died. End of the kingdom. That is, it made us, it boded, is that the past tense? It bade. It implied the end of the kingdom. Josiah is succeeded by these 3 sons. One is Jehoahaz. Now remember that the kingdom was in this period where big empires are developing in the east. The Assyrians already had conquered Israel and a lot of Judah. Now the Assyrians themselves were replaced by the Babylonians. And the Babylonians were really tough. They're from the same general region, the region that is Iraq now, and they're trying to capture Judah, and the Egyptians are. And so in this period, the Egyptians are stronger. And so the Pharaoh takes the son of Josiah, King Jehoahaz, and he imprisons him. And instead, he makes his brother Jehoiakim the king. So what's going on here? It's presumably these outside kings are picking the guy who will serve their interests. They're cutting deals. So I'm going to take your brother off the throne. I'm going to put him in prison. I'm going to make you on the throne, and you're going to do what I say. Yes, sir, Mr. Pharaoh, sir. Then Jehoiakim was surrounded by the Babylonians who came to take it back. During the course of that, apparently Jehoiakim died, and his son Jehoiachin, similar name, took the throne instead, just in time to get imprisoned by the Babylonians, because now the Babylonian king is in charge. King didn't seem like a really good job in this period. And this one is imprisoned by not just any old king of Babylon, but by the famous Nebuchadnezzar. So now you've got one son of Josiah imprisoned in Egypt. You got another one imprisoned in Babylonia. Nebuchadnezzar carries off some of the people of Judah into exile. And he puts yet another one on the throne. So you understand, it's musical thrones, and it's these outside powers are putting who they want on the throne, who will serve them. So he takes Jehoiakim's uncle Zedekiah. And Zedekiah is worth noting because he's the last one. He's the last king of Judah on the throne. And he is also, being, the uncle of the last king, he's another son of King Josiah. And he's made king by Nebuchadnezzar, but then he rebels against Nebuchadnezzar. That was probably a really bad idea. That was one of the worst ideas the Jews ever had until they tried rebelling against the Romans in AD. That was a really bad idea. He rebels against Babylonia. Nebuchadnezzar comes back. Now, when Nebuchadnezzar left, it was in the year 597 BCE, and I think his last words were, "Don't make me come back." And he did come back. It was 10 years later. It was 587 BCE. And he captured King Zedekiah. He killed all of his sons, all of Zedekiah's sons in front of him, and then blinded him. So that the last thing he saw was all of his children getting killed. And then he was taken back in chains back to Babylonia. Now remember I told you earlier that kings don't necessarily kill other kings? It takes a very powerful and confident king to be willing to blind and chain and kill and imprison other kings. And apparently Nebuchadnezzar was that kind of guy. And they destroyed Jerusalem, they tore down the walls, they destroyed the palace, they destroyed all the big buildings, and they destroyed the temple. And you don't have to learn a lot of years in this course, but you have to know that one, because that is a turning point in history, 587 BCE. In some books you'll see it as 586. And then there was a big captivity. And in 3 different books of the Bible, it tells 3 different numbers of how many they took, but it's something like 15,000. Now, people talk about the Babylonian captivity as if all the Jews were carried off to Babylon. And it's true that in centuries after that, there was always, until very recently, there was always a tremendous Jewish community in that region that was Babylon. But that community was not like all of the Jews. Most of the Jews are still back in Judah. So the Babylonians would take the people who were useful to them, educated people, craftsmen, the upper classes, the priests, the royal family. They took those who would be serviceable to them in their country. And those Jews lived in exile in Babylonia. Now there's no more kings on the throne. So the whole question of the Davidic covenant and the Messianic line becomes an open question. Will there ever be a Messiah on the throne again? And that question will remain through the whole destiny of Judaism and Christianity. Instead, they appoint a governor over the Jews. Nebuchadnezzar makes this man Gedaliah the governor. His full name is Gedaliah, son of Achikam, son of Shaphan. Shaphan, you'll recall, was the scribe who went to the priest Hilkiah at the temple. Josiah had sent him and said, how are the repairs of the temple coming? And Hilkiah said, I found a book, and they take the book and they read it to the king. That was Shaphan in the middle of all that. It is his grandson is now the governor over the Jews. That is to say, they were a member of a party that is perceived to be a pro-Babylonian party. So Nebuchadnezzar makes him the governor. We have found a couple of inscriptions of actual ring impressions referring to people named son of Shaphan. So we know there was this family at the time, and they were pro-Josiah. And Gedaliah's left in charge. Now what happens is, it says a member of the royal family, he's like a cousin or something, he's not happy that instead of one of the royal family, which was, his connection, his everything, that they're all out, and that it's this governor instead. So he does what any of us would do under the circumstances. He comes with a lot of men and he assassinates Gedaliah. And then he murders people who he finds on their way to Jerusalem, on their way to the temple. Now that's confusing because there shouldn't be any temple there, but it says there are all these people coming mourning on their way to the temple. We'll come back to that. So that date, the assassination of Gedaliah, is a Jewish fast day to this day. So it's considered a turning point. And you go, what's the big deal? I mean, all the kings are gone. The king's blinded and in chains in prison, and we don't have a Zedekiah fast day. But what happens with Gedaliah is when he is assassinated, now the people are really scared. Nebuchadnezzar's last words were something like "Hasta la vista, baby," or "Don't make me come back," or something like that. And they don't want to be there when the most powerful man in the world with his army comes back and says, "I understand that you people assassinated the guy I appointed as your governor." I mean, that's a really bad time to be around. So it says, and you got to get this carefully, in the last section of the last chapter of the book of 2 Kings, it says, "And all the people arose, from the smallest to the biggest," or else it means from the youngest to the oldest, "and they went to Egypt because they were afraid of the Chaldeans." Chaldeans is the other word for Babylonians. All the people, it says. Nobody left. Now, when it says all the people, yes, it is possible that there were some peasants left on the land, but they're explicit that it's everybody goes to Egypt. Now, this is a very strange fact because when you read any histories of this period, they're all focused on Babylon and the exiles to Babylon, which explicitly in the numbers are only something like 15,000. Whereas the mass of the people go to Egypt, and nobody ever talks about it. And to make it even more confusing, think back when I talked to you about Deuteronomy 28, the curse list. And I said, what's the last curse? What's the worst thing you can put on the Jews? And the last curse is, and you'll go back to Egypt, you'll sell yourselves as slaves there to your enemies, and they won't buy you. I mean, you won't even be as bad off as you were before. So the last curse is you'll go back to Egypt. The last sentences of the book of 2 Kings are, they went back to Egypt. And as far as I know, nobody in the history of the interpretation of the Bible has ever connected those two facts. If you look at all the commentaries on Deuteronomy 28, on that verse, you can look it up yourself, Deuteronomy 28:68, all the commentaries, they have no comment to make about the curse that you'll go back to Egypt. Or there was one that said, this is such a strange curse, a strange and frightening curse, that they would all go back to Egypt, but we don't know of any reflex of this anywhere in the Bible. And I'm going, what? And all of those notions where it said eventually God would hide his face, remember at the end of Deuteronomy 31 when Moses gives the Torah book to the Levites, And then in the song of Deuteronomy 32, it says, I will hide my face from them. I will see what their end will be. That it's predicting a day where God won't be available anymore. The ultimate curse. And here it is. If you look at the words there, it says they were cast out from before Yahweh's face. Meaning his presence. That's a tremendous thing. It's all come true. It has all hit the fan. And that's your history from Genesis to the end of 2 Kings. That text is called the primary history. And that's 11 books of the Bible. And the primary history starts with creation, and then it's got covenant with Abraham and all this great stuff, and now things are really turning bad. There was, in fact, an Egyptian Jewish community. The last we knew of them was at Elephantine, which was an Egyptian city, I started to say down the Nile, up the Nile. You know the thing that the Nile is one of the only rivers in the world that flows south to north instead of north to south. You think the Mississippi, the Missouri, all the rivers you normally know of flow north to south. That's why we think of the north as up and the south as down. Whenever you see a globe, it has the North Pole up there and it has the South Pole down there. And the reason for this, people always thought of north as up because the river was flowing from there. But in Egypt, it was the opposite. When you read it in the Egyptians, they talk about Upper and Lower Egypt. Upper Egypt means south, and Lower Egypt means north, and that drives the rest of us from the rest of the world crazy because it's backwards. So up the Nile at Elephantine, there was a Jewish mercenary colony there. And that's interesting because at the end of 2 Kings it says explicitly that the army went with the people all the way down to Egypt. And apparently settled in Elephantine and hired themselves out as a mercenary colony, presumably protecting the southern border of Egypt. And they built a temple there where they worshiped Yahweh and two other gods. And that temple eventually was destroyed in what is arguably the first pogrom of Jews in history, where the people of Elephantine destroyed the temple. It was never rebuilt. You can't go and see the site of it anymore because in the 1950s, was it, they built the Aswan Dam in Egypt, and now all of that is underwater. So take your diving gear with you if you go on a trip to Egypt to see the temple at Elephantine. And do keep in mind that they have crocodiles in there, you know. Now this sounds pretty terrible, and so it's a pretty awful way to end a book of the Bible with all of this. But they give you this little hope at the end. The last 4 verses at the end of 2 Kings say, oh, by the way, later on, Jehoiakim, right, that grandson of Josiah who was imprisoned in Babylon, that he was allowed out of prison and sat with the other kings at the Babylonian king's table. So there is this hope. There is still a descendant of David who's alive, and he's not ruling back in Jerusalem, but he's alive, and he's having children, and there is still a messianic hope, presumably through Jehoiakim. But that going to Egypt has never been given all the attention that it deserves. It's much stronger in the book of Jeremiah, which we're not reading in this course. That's in my next course. The prophet Jeremiah was, the big prophet at this time. And the story is that he had predicted all of this. He said, the Babylonians are going to come, they're going to destroy the temple, they're going to destroy the city. And this just made everybody mad at him. He was imprisoned. He lived this miserable, miserable life. If you ever want a true downer, depressing book, then you read Jeremiah. This man suffered his whole life being a prophet. But then it all happens. So everything he predicted comes true. So it says the people come to him after Gedaliah is assassinated, and they're really scared now. And they said, we now know you were the true prophet. And those other prophets who said everything was going to be all right, they were the liars. You're the true one. You tell us what to do, and that's what we'll do. And Jeremiah says, I'll talk to God. I'll get back to you. He goes away for 2 weeks. He comes back, and he says, God told me to tell you, whatever you do, don't go to Egypt. don't go to Egypt. This sounds vaguely like God saying to Adam and Eve, you can eat from all the trees of the garden except that one. Don't eat from that tree. And you know what they're going to do. So he says, don't go to Egypt. Don't throw me in the briar patch. No, that was a different story. And all the people say to Jeremiah, verily a prophet of lies thou art. And they all go to Egypt, including him. The text says that they take Jeremiah with them. And so if you read almost any commentary on the book of Jeremiah, they say that he was taken as a prisoner by the people, forced into Egyptian exile. Now the text never says that. And I think scholars have gone too far saying Jeremiah was taken by force. Presumably the reason they get that is that they deduce it from the fact that he said, well, God told us don't go to Egypt, so the only way he would have gone is if the people dragged him there. But I don't think that's right. He told them, God says you, the people, shouldn't go to Egypt. But if they all go, he's a prophet. A prophet's job is with the people. What's he supposed to do? Stay back in Jerusalem and preach to the stones? I mean, his job is to be with the people. So he goes with them, and he ends up finishing out his life and dying in Egypt. But it's almost funny the way it comes out in the book of Jeremiah. But so you're the true prophet. You're the true prophet. What should we do? Don't go to Egypt. You're a prophet of lies. Prophet of lies. And they all go to Egypt. And so by the end of the story, they've learned very little, and we just have the one hope of this, former king of Judah who's let out of prison back in Babylon. Any questions now? The primary history. We've gone Genesis to 2 Kings. They're in big trouble. They will get out of it. The Bible ain't over yet. Okay, the three books you had to read for today were Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther, and also Psalm 137. Psalm 137 is a famous one, By the Rivers of Babylon, and it's clearly written by a Jew in Babylonian exile, and it gives you a sense of how they felt about their condition there. It's been made into a reggae song. You know, there's actually been several musical versions of this particular psalm, and they do lend themselves to that. It's our understanding that they were sung in ancient Israel. The book of Psalms is probably the hymn book of the temple, and they would perform it. There are references in some of the Psalms to musical instruments, to a choir leader. They sang these. We don't have their melodies, so there are all kinds of people today composing really great new melodies for the Psalms, and So if you prefer the Bob Marley, Psalm 137, that's fine. So it's by the rivers of Babylon, there we sat, also we wept when we remembered Zion. By the willows in it, we hung up our harps, because there our captors demanded of us the words of a song, and our persecutors demanded joy. Sing us a song of Zion. How shall we sing a song of Yahweh on foreign soil? They are confronting a new question now. Until this time, they've associated God with country. They are now out of their country. Is God still with them? How do you sing a song of Yahweh in Babylon? If I forget you, Jerusalem, let my right arm forget. The English translations always add a noun there. I mean, let my right arm forget its cunning is a common one, I think, since the King James. And it's poetry. You need to lighten up. In poetry, if it says, if I forget you, then let my right arm forget, you don't have to supply a noun for what it is your right arm is supposed to forget. It's poetry. Just take it easy and read it and translate it as poetry. Let my tongue cleave to my palate if I don't remember you, if I don't lift up Jerusalem over my highest joy. Remember, Yahweh, the Edomites with the day of Jerusalem, who said, tear it up, down to its foundation. And now here's how they feel about the Babylonians, and then we'll go back to the Edomites. Daughter of Babylon, who is despoiled, happy is he who pays you back your recompense that you paid us. Happy is he who takes hold of your suckling baby and smashes it against a rock. End of Psalm. They weren't happy with the Babylonians. Hitting babies against... Now, again, it's a poem. It doesn't mean that if they had a chance, they'd go out and grab all the Babylonian babies and whack them against rocks. It is poetry, but they're expressing the depth of their anguish. Now, what the heck are they mentioning Edomites for in the middle of all of this? Here's my theory. The Babylonians didn't destroy the temple. It's reported in 4 different places in the Bible. It's in the book of Kings where we read it, that the Babylonians instead, it said, destroyed the city walls and the palace and the big people's houses and the temple. The Beit Yahweh, it says the house of Yahweh. Specifically, it says the house of Yahweh and the house of the king. The Beit Yahweh, Beit HaMelech. Then if you look in the book of Chronicles, same report. Slightly different words. Then you look in the book of Jeremiah, the last chapter. Jeremiah, because he's the big prophet at the time, they take the same report that's in the end of 2 Kings, and it's tacked on as the last chapter of the book of Jeremiah. Same thing. Destroyed the house of the king, the house of Yahweh, the big city, the big town, the walls, all of that. But then there's a 4th place where it's mentioned, which is in the middle of Jeremiah, which is the book of Jeremiah's own report of what happened. And there it says, and they destroyed the house of the king and all the big houses of the people and tore down the walls. And you go, well, you left something out. What about the house of Yahweh? It doesn't mention the destruction of the temple. Now you might say, no, that's a scribal error. That's a very common scribal error. Right? It said house. That's Beit of the Lord, Yahweh. And the house, Beit, the king, HaMelech. Okay? Melech is Hebrew for king. We make a big deal of that Martin Luther King's initials are MLK, which is Hebrew for Melech, which means king. Could that have happened just by chance? Okay, anyway, I like that one. Beit Yahweh Beit HaMelech. And it's a common scribal thing. Many of you have done this when you write a first draft of when you type out a first draft of and then you're going over and doing a second draft, and your eye skips from this word bait to this word bait, and you leave out everything that's in the middle of it. That has a name even. That's called a haplography. When you leave something out because the same word occurs more than once, your eye jumps. Sometimes people leave out a whole paragraph by haplography. The opposite of that, by the way, is a dittography, as in the word ditto, where you write the same thing twice by mistake. In scribal stuff, you get into all of this stuff. So they say this is an obvious haplography, that it said in the original text there in Jeremiah, they destroyed the temple and they destroyed the palace. But the scribe's eye jumped from one house of to the next house of. That's one explanation. That's fair. It's possible. Except in the chapter right after these guys assassinate Gedaliah, it says they're riding away, escaping, and they bump into some people who are coming from Shechem and Samaria and Shiloh. Only places that begin with S. And they're on their way to Jerusalem, it says, mourning and bringing sacrifices for the temple. And you go, what do you mean bringing sacrifices for the temple? There is no more temple. It's been destroyed. And so most scholars answer that one by saying that they're just going to the site of the temple and referring to that as the temple, and that maybe they still continued to offer sacrifices on the site of the temple, which seems almost impossible because it's no longer the place where God causes his name, his ark, to dwell. I put these two facts together and I say, in Jeremiah, the most complete version of the story, there is no mention of destroying the temple. Maybe they didn't destroy it. It's still there. And in the very next chapter, you have people going there to sacrifice because it's still there. And it's the other three versions, the short versions, that collapse that into one thing. Oh yeah, they destroyed the temple and they destroyed and they make it all one. But it wasn't all one. The destruction of temple happened later in one of two ways. Either the Babylonians came back after all of this and destroyed it, so maybe it was a year or two later, or maybe the Edomites did it. Edom is the country next door. They're unhappy. They've had terrible relations with the Jews in history. Remember, King David had conquered them. Judah had ruled them for centuries. And so this song, Psalm 137, while they're so angry at the Babylonians, where they're living there, who imprisoned them and did all these terrible things to them, and they say, and by the way, God, don't forget the Edomites with the day of Jerusalem who said, tear it up, tear it up. Now, I can't prove any of that. I really think it's true. And it may not matter. The temple's gone. But there was a guy, there was Morgenstern was a biblical scholar in the early part of the 20th century, and he published several articles fighting for the fact that there weren't two temples in Jerusalem, there were three, because he read all these examples and he said, oh, it must be that there was a temple destroyed by the Babylonians and another one that was destroyed by the Edomites. Until later, the third one will be destroyed by the Romans after, much later. And I read Morgenstern's stuff at first, and I said, gee, his case is pretty good that the Edomites destroyed a temple. And they go, wait a minute, it's that the Babylonians didn't destroy a temple. It's that the Edomites destroyed the temple. Yeah.
Judgment against Edom is a common theme throughout the prophets, Isaiah, Obadiah, Joel. It's kind of all over the place, and they, a lot of times, the prophets trace it back to Esau, and it seems like they're associating kind of a narrative causality to it, tracing all the way back to the wandering in the desert and even back all the way to Jacob and Esau. So do you think it's possible that Psalm 137 being a poem, like you were saying, that maybe they're just combining the two as kind of a narrative structure, basically making their enemies one single people?
It could be that. There is something that's done, you'll find among modern Jews, especially religious Israeli Jews, associating anybody bad, any enemy, with the Amalekites. You can go to Jerusalem in religious neighborhoods and see graffiti in big letters on walls saying, remember what Amalek did to you. And those are references to Hitler. There's references to the Nazis in World War II. And we're going to read, say, the book of Esther, where the villain is Haman, and there are some who identify Haman with the Amalekites. So it could be that the Edomites, too, are something like that, like the quintessential symbol of the enemy. And it could be something like that. My sense is different of that. I think it is really more specific to the actual historical relations with the Edomites. That when you read the story of Jacob and Esau in Genesis, Esau never does anything wrong. They're not very critical of Esau. In fact, it's very sympathetic to Esau. He comes in and he's in pain when he realizes that his brother has gotten away his birthright. And he swears he's going to kill his brother for that. The brother, Jacob, has to flee, but when Jacob comes back, Esau runs up and he kisses him. And after that, they're okay. And it's only, you're right, in the wilderness period, when the Israelites are coming through with Moses, that they say to the Edomites, we're your brother, we just need to pass through your land. If we drink any of your water, we'll pay for it. Where there's no, and the Edomites say, you're not coming in our land, we're coming out at you if you do that. And God tells Moses, okay, look, they're your brothers, you're descended from twin brothers, leave them alone. And it's only later when David conquers the Edomites that it really gets bad. And I will tell you, ultimately in Jewish history, there is, Jews don't believe in forced conversion to Judaism. But there's one exception in Jewish history, and that was one of the Hasmonean kings, which is post-biblical period, intertestamental Hellenistic period. One of the Hasmonean kings of the Jews converted the Idumeans, which are the Edomites, by the sword. That turned out to be ironic because the most famous Idumean Edomite of all time was Herod, who became the king of the Jews, and not exactly our most popular guy, to Jews or Christians. So don't convert people by the sword, it's a bad idea. So there is this long history that's very complicated between Judah and Edom, which are right next door to each other. And the very fact that the Jews write a story about Jacob and Esau saying, we and they are descended from twin brothers, means they recognize that these are the people they're the closest to on earth. They're not as close to Moabites or Ammonites, right? Because they're the children of Lot and his daughters. So that would make them first cousins once removed of the Jews, whereas Edomites are the twin brothers of the Jews. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm even thinking about in Numbers how, the account of Edom denying him passage. Right after that, we get the story with Balaam, and like in his fourth oracle, when he's pronouncing judgment, he combines basically one phrase right after another. He combines Moab, Edom, a bunch of different people, but they're all combined like in one fell swoop. So it does. There does seem like there's something there.
I think there is. There are mixed feelings about it. Like Americans are going through, two different, very opposing points of view about the immigration of Mexicans here. And nobody's making a big fuss about the immigration of Canadians. We do have two long borders, but so it's hostility to people who are very, very close and yet different. And you had that between Judah and Edom, I think. It's not a perfect analogy, Maybe I shouldn't use that, but I try to be relevant. It's in the news. Every morning I turn on the news, it's a big election issue, so there you are. I just toss out this speculation at you that the Edomites may have stayed much more involved in the Jews' destiny than you would have thought. And you might almost say, okay, fair enough, we took it from Esau, so, okay, his descendants got us one, Who knows, maybe somebody back then thought of it that way. But otherwise, there's this very strange line in Psalm 137, and there's this strange case of people coming to offer sacrifices at a temple that shouldn't have been there anymore, and this fact that the temple of all things is left out in the book of Jeremiah in the account of what happened, the most complete account. And I'm not really, even though, look, I'm a Bible scholar, I do this stuff. I've identified haplographies and dittographies in the text, but this one is not your average haplography. You're leaving out the destruction of the temple? A scribe does that and doesn't notice it, and nobody else ever notices it and fixes it in the text for hundreds of years? I don't think so. So, But one of my teachers, each of my teachers gave me something, good and useful, and one of them, Paul Hansen, is one of my professors at Harvard, and he said there's a lot of gamesmanship to this. So I never forgot that. We're toying with stuff. If you're good at chess, you'll be better at this. If you're really good at football. What made me first like football, let me just get this out of the way. We are at the University of Georgia, after all. We're in the Department of Religion, and almost everybody who's ever moved to Georgia has been told that sentence. When you first arrive, they say, football is almost a religion here, except some of them leave out the word almost. So, okay, it's appropriate to speak of this. What brought me to football was different from most. I didn't like football growing up. I was like most people who don't like football or don't follow it very much. It looked like just a bunch of guys banging into each other. I thought, this is a ridiculous game. So I didn't watch football. It was a great disappointment to my father. My sister always sat and watched football with him. I didn't. And then I was in graduate school already, and I was in the sharing an apartment with a few guys, and we got into chess for a while. And we're all playing these very serious, complicated chess games. And during all of that were the great years of the Miami Dolphins under their great genius coach, Don Shula. And there was a It wasn't the Super Bowl, it was the one before the Super Bowl, I think, where they were ahead, the Dolphins, but their backs against the wall, and their quarterback, Bob Greasy, he's pushed all the way back, so he's in his own end zone. So if he's tackled there, it's going to be a safety and 2 points for the other team. And they're ahead by 6 points. He's pushed back, he hikes the ball, and he's back in the end zone, and he's running around back there. And he doesn't pass, and then he goes forward again, so now they're like on the 1 yard line, and it's another down. And they hike it to him, and he goes back, and he's running around in the end zone again, and finally the other team tackles him there, and they get their 2 points. And then they realized there were only seconds left on the clock, and the Dolphins had been ahead by 6 points, and this gave 2 to the other team. So the other team was going to need more than a field goal to catch up. And they were going to have to take a kickoff and get all the way down, and even the announcers, even Howard Cosell, missed it. And I'm watching this, I go, boy, that was really a brilliant move. Oh, football isn't just guys banging into each other. There's like strategy. It's like chess, except moving. And the greatest football coaches, they are, after all, they're like the greatest chess players, except they also have to know psychology. In chess, you don't have to know the psychology of your chess pieces. In football, you have to know how to deal with all your players. You need this constant, you get the idea. I'm glad I got that off my chest. You learn many things in this course. Now, there isn't that much literature from the period of exile, and this is a very strange thing. You had that one psalm that talks about what's going on in exile. Next, we're going to have the books of Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther, which take place after the immediate exile technically is over, because the Jews are eventually permitted to go back to their land. But actual stories of what's happening in exile are very, very few. There's the book of Daniel, which we don't cover in this course because I don't like it. I just feel that everybody should get to pick one book that they like the least, and that's not in their Bible, see? And a lot of people would throw out Esther, but I'll make a case for keeping Esther. But for me, I never much liked Daniel. Daniel is the latest book of the Old Testament. The evidence is it was written during the Hellenistic period. And it's very strange because it involves this man Daniel, who's there as a young man at the destruction and the capture, the captivity by the Babylonians. And then he's living in Babylon. But then later, he's there and involved during the time when the Persians rule the land. It's under Darius, which means Daniel must have lived a long time. And it doesn't quite add up, and the kings aren't all in the order, right? And it's a very spacey book. If you know, the latter part has these extraordinary prophecies that aren't like other prophecies. They sound, frankly, like acid trips, I hear. And the mushroom was known then in Persia, and people have surmised that maybe, he was, having visions. And so on. But you can go ahead and read Daniel, that's fine. Meanwhile, yeah.
Why did we do Ruth?
Oh, Ruth. I do like Ruth. That's a good one. The primary history that we've been reading does not include Ruth. There is a separate group of texts that are called the 5 Scrolls. Okay, and those are Ruth, Esther, Song of Songs, Ecclesiastes, and Lamentations. And those 5 come up in the 3rd unit of this. The way I'm dividing this up now to teach the entire Hebrew Bible takes 3 courses. And the first one is this one, where we're reading all of the narrative books of the Bible that tell the whole story, except Chronicles because it overlaps so much with Kings and Samuel. So we read through all of that. Next semester, I give the course that we cover all 15 books of the prophets. And then the fall of next year, I'll give a 3rd course that's only now being added to the catalog, so it'll be Religion 4003, that will cover all those remaining books, so Ruth would come up there. Now, the reason that seems out of place is because Bibles come in different order. Bibles that come as a translation from the ancient Hebrew, the Masoretic text, have the books in the order that we've just been reading them. But books that Bible translations that follow the Greek order, some of the books are in a different place. Christian Bibles generally follow the Greek order. Jewish Bibles generally follow the Hebrew order. The books are the same books. They're the same words and all that, but some of the books of the Bible are in a different order. And in the Christian order, the book of Ruth comes right after the book of Judges because it takes place around the time of Judges. And it says at the beginning of Ruth, and it happened in the time of the Judges. So you get that. And she's the great-grandmother of King David, so it's, time-wise, that's where it belongs. But in the Jewish order, it's with these 5 scrolls, and you don't read it until you get to it later. So I am keeping it separate because the person who gave you the history from Joshua to 2 Kings is not the person who wrote the book of Ruth. It isn't where it originally went. It was inserted there by people who said, yeah, but it's logical to put it there. But a lot of the Bible isn't logical in its chronological order. Yeah?
Question about Daniel. So correct me if I'm wrong, but from what I've read, the scholarship that places its writing in the Hellenistic period, that's from scholarship that doesn't accept the prophetic apocalyptic writings as authentically prophetic. They say that it's looking at history in hindsight and superimposing them. So, is that the case? It's more driven by a theological bias?
That's probably fair. Since I don't like Daniel, I haven't done any Daniel scholarship, but I have read a little. And he predicts these, like the 4 empires, it would appear to be. And so people take those as Assyrian, Babylonian, Persian, and Greek. But Greek wouldn't have happened yet, so because he's apparently predicting the arrival of Alexander the Great and the Greeks and all of that, they say, well, it must have been written in the Hellenistic period, right? Because they don't believe that somebody would really predict that when, the Greeks were still in Europe. They're not in the picture yet. They were known, but they were not in the, moving around there. So, it's part of it is, scholars who don't believe that that's really prophecy. For those who, if you're a religious person who believes a prophet can really do that, there are people who think there are prophecies in the Bible, things that happen in modern Israel and in the United States and stuff like that. I'm not one of those. And in a university, that we're open to any possibility, but it requires evidence. You have to be able to test a hypothesis. So a thing like that's more a matter of faith than hypothesis. What can we say? It's between you and your heart. Ezra, on the other hand, Ezra and Nehemiah are historical persons, and there's not much in the way of prophecy. Notably, in the books of Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther, which are the books that tell the last events in the story, not only do you no longer have the words, and the Lord appeared unto. Like, remember we said the last time you had that was Solomon, I said the last angel, and the last this, and the last that, when we're tracing these various things going out of the story. In Ezra and Nehemiah and Esther, there are no miracles. The words, and the Lord said unto anyone, don't even occur. There are no prophecies. There are no miracles. There are no angels. There are no talking animals. There are no splitting seas. All of that stuff that represented the presence of God is gone. The last thing left was the ark in the tabernacle at the first temple in Jerusalem. When that temple was destroyed, they're out of the story. And it's one of the great mysteries of the Bible. What happened to the ark? That's why they made such a good movie out of it. Because when you think back on it, you can't even say when it was that the ark stopped being in the story. Here's the ark with the tablets in it. It's the most important thing in the world. If you could find it today, it would be the most valuable thing in the world. The word priceless doesn't capture it. It would be an extraordinary, if you could find a little piece, if you could find one of the cherubs from the top of it, anything, right? A little piece of stone from one of the tablets that just says, honor your, and so you're pretty sure that's what it is. And it just goes out of the story, and you have to stop and say to yourself, wait a minute, when was the last time I heard the ark mentioned in the story? And then you have to read back all the way through all the kings to figure out when the last time you saw the ark of the tabernacle in the story. And then in the second temple, nobody thinks there was an ark in the second temple or a tabernacle. All the Urim and Tumim, the stick that had become blossomed, all those things that were supposed to be there in the first temple are not there in the second temple. And we don't know what happened to them. So it's a time of great mystery, this exile period. And now the second temple happens. And this all comes during the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, the rebuilding of the land, the rebuilding of the temple. It's around, people argue, there's tremendous debate about the dates of this, but Ezra and Nehemiah are something like 450 BCE. And Ezra is in Babylon. He's one of the Jews living in Babylon. They've been there since 587. And it says, Ezra was a ready scribe in the Torah of Yahweh, which he had given to Moses, or the Torah of Moses. Look at the wording there. It's a little unclear. And you find out that Ezra has several things. One, he is a scribe. That means he writes out texts for a living. Two, he is a priest. He's from the old Levite priestly families. Three, it tells you what kind of priest he is. He's one of the priests descended from Aaron. And the emperor of the Persians sends him back to the Jewish community back in Judah. Now, what are they doing back in Judah? The Assyrians were succeeded by the Babylonians. The Babylonians were succeeded by the Persians. The Persians, under their great king, the Emperor Cyrus, who's called Cyrus the Great, had a much more liberal policy towards people they conquered than the Babylonians or the Assyrians did. Their idea was, make them happy and then they won't rebel against you. So Cyrus, in his very first year as emperor, allows the Jews to return to their land. There's a famous cylinder inscription of Cyrus, which they make a big deal of it to this day in Iran, where he was like giving freedom to the Jews and all the other peoples who had been conquered and were part of the Persian Empire. And they all became these various states. They didn't have kings. They had governors who were under the Persian Empire. So Persia then is what is today Iran. And he sends Ezra back, and he has this specific sentence that he says, according to the text to Ezra. He says, according to the wisdom of your God, which is in your hand, set judges and magistrates who may judge all the people who are across the river. Presumably that means either the Euphrates or else across the Jordan. To all who know the laws of your God, and teach all those who do not know. That is, he gives Ezra the right to return to the Jews who are back in Judah. They're in Jerusalem. They're rebuilding the temple. And he gives him charge of it. He's the governor. And he is to govern the people by some document that he has, the law of your God, which is in your hand. Teach them if they don't know the laws. And then he goes back and he has them do a variety of things. And if you look at the things that Ezra imposes on the people, they are things from all over the Torah. So it is understood in the story that it's the Torah. It's the books of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, is this law of his God that is in his hand. And he comes back and now he rules the Jews, and the Torah is their constitution. And if you want to have an idea of how powerful he is, this Ezra, that he can enforce all this, remember, he's now working for the most powerful man in the world. He has the authority of the emperor of the world on his side. And he is given power of life and death. He can execute you if you don't do what he says. And he goes back and he finds out that a great many people there who are wealthier have lent money to others, and then they can't pay back the money, so they're foreclosing on their property. It's like going completely against all the stuff we saw in the Torah about not wanting that to happen. So Ezra orders everybody who has lent money to anybody to forgive the loan. They don't have to pay you back. And everybody does it. I know you owe me $50,000, but 50,000 drachmas or shekels or whatever, but Ezra said you don't have to pay me back. And they all do it. And then Ezra says, I see a lot of you have married women who aren't Jews. They're from these other areas. Now, there's nothing wrong with that in the whole Bible. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, Moses, David, Solomon, they all married women from other backgrounds and nationalities and faiths. Biblically, a woman takes the religion of her husband. There's no exception to that. When any woman doesn't take the religion of her husband, like Jezebel and Atalia, they're regarded as evil and they end up getting killed. When in the book of Ruth that you mentioned, she's a Moabite and she does take the religion of her husband, she's considered a great heroine, she's wonderful, and her great-grandson is the king of the Jews. So in the entire Bible, there's no such thing as conversion. There's no single case of anybody ever converting to Judaism in the Bible. But what you have is women automatically get the religion of their husband. But what Ezra sees is it's not working out that way. They're all just, doing other religions. And so he declares every Jewish man who has a wife who's not Jewish, you send your wife and children away. Throw them out. And they all do it. That's a powerful guy. That's even bigger than you don't have to pay back the loans. And it seems, I would say to most people nowadays, you would say that's horrible. But our judgment morally of that, or our judgment religiously or theologically of that, is our judgment. In that world, at that moment, he saw a threat to the existence of his people, and he said, this isn't allowed. It had always been allowed before that. And to this day, intermarriage is a very big issue in Judaism. It's quite dramatically changed currently. In the United States right now, I think 50% of Jewish marriages are to people who aren't Jewish. But 50% is tremendously high, and that changed just in my lifetime. When I was a kid, intermarriage was still a very rare thing. So it starts apparently with Ezra. Now at the same time, there's another guy, the shortest man in the Bible, second shortest man in the Bible, Nehemiah, and Nehemiah is a book that's written mostly, it seems, by Nehemiah. It's told in first person, and the book of Ezra is told about the time in third person. And it's funny because in Nehemiah talks about himself and how involved he is, and apparently he is the governor over the Jews, and he and Ezra together somehow have divided responsibilities. And it's very much about himself, whereas if you look at, and he talks about Ezra, but they're both involved. Whereas if you look at the book of Ezra, it never talks about Nehemiah, so, poor guy. And together, though, they're involved in getting the Jews to rebuild the temple. They are attacked and challenged by Samaritans. Now, who are the Samaritans? When the northern kingdom of Israel was destroyed by the Assyrians in 722, what the Assyrians used to do as their method of dealing with conquered peoples was they played musical peoples with the people they conquered. And they'd pick up these Israelites who they conquered and put some of them in exile over there. And they'd take people from there and they put them over there and take some other people and put them in what was Israel. So the people who end up in Israel are called the Samaritans because Samaria was the capital of Israel. So this is the beginning now, during the Ezra days, of the period where these Samaritans, these foreigners who now live in Israel, are in conflict with the Jews rebuilding Judah. And it's a very tenuous relationship from ever after. There are Samaritans living in Israel to this day, and their Bible is the Torah. The Bible is only the first 5 books of the Bible. So when you say the Bible, you have to understand not only are there different orders of the books, but for the Samaritans it's just the first 5 books. For the Jews it's the 39 books of the Hebrew Bible. For Protestants it's those plus the books of the New Testament. For Catholics it's the Old Testament and New Testament books plus 10 extras that are added to the Old Testament, which aren't in the Protestants or the Jews' Bible. The Protestants and Jews refer to those 10 books as the Apocrypha. So when you say the Bible, you better always clarify who you're talking about or what. So here are these Samaritans, but the Jews write letters to the emperor, and he gives them authority. Now there's one other book that takes place in all of this, that like Ezra and Nehemiah has no, and the Lord said unto, and no prophets, and no miracles, and none of that. And that's the book of Esther. And what's most striking about Esther is God isn't even mentioned in it. There are 2 books of the Bible where God isn't mentioned. One is Esther, and one is the Song of Songs, also known as Song of Solomon. This is so striking that when they set the canon of the Bible, when rabbis met in the 2nd century CE and they voted on which books were in the Bible and which ones weren't, there was opposition to Esther. They thought this book shouldn't be there. And I think it wasn't just because God isn't mentioned in it. I had a professor who was very English. And when he taught us about Esther, I've never forgotten it, he said, well, gentlemen, we were only guys in that class. Well, gentlemen, the book of Esther is a very dirty book. And what? Now, when you say a book is a dirty book, I mean, dirty can have several meanings. One dirty can mean like dirty tricks in politics, where you say that was dirty. Or second, it can mean just ethically bad stuff, like, oh, well, that was a dirty thing you did, like that. Or it can mean sex, because we all know that sex is dirty. So when he said Esther is a very dirty book, he meant all 3, as far as I can tell. The book of Esther is very strange, right? So the story briefly is that the king of the entire Persian Empire, the emperor, who's identified in that book as something like Ahasuerus, Ahasueros. It is presumably a Hebrew pronunciation of Xerxes, Xerxes in Persian. And he has this beautiful wife named Vashti, and he gives a big banquet for all of these kings who are under all of, the kings, rulers, governors of all of his provinces. And he wants to show off the beauty of his wife, so he summons his wife Vashti to come, and she says, no, she won't come. And the advisors of the king say, well, this is terrible, because if the wife of the king doesn't come when he tells her to come, then all the women in the Persian Empire will think they don't have to come when their husbands tell them to come. Well, you can't run a society like that. So he de-queens her. He throws her out. That's why you get that famous song, I'm going to Vashti queen right out of my hair. And a little more. And then, being a brilliant king, he almost immediately notices that he doesn't have a queen, so they hold this contest to pick a new queen. Now, when I was a kid in Sunday school, they led me to believe it was like a beauty contest, like with all these women walking in bathing suits and high heels, because I know all of you women like to wear high heels when you go to the beach. And that is so bad. But it's not a beauty contest. It says they have a house next to, there's the king's house, which is the palace, and there's the women's house. And they gather virgins from all over the empire, because again, it's this thing with the virgins they have in the Near East. And they have all these virgins come, and each one gets one night with the king. And after spending one night with the king, the one that he'll pick to keep coming back is going to be the new queen and replace Vashti. Now there's this woman, and her name is Esther. And Esther has this cousin, her guardian, Mordecai. And Mordecai sends Esther, and he says, I want you to enter this contest. So she goes, and she's in the women's house, and the night when it's her turn with the king, she's allowed to have any perfumes, any clothing, anything she wants when she goes. And she says, I don't want anything, just very simply. She goes in, and now I don't know what she knew that all the other women in Persia didn't know, but she kept getting called back. I mean, he liked Esther. And this is where those who say, well, there's no God and no miracles in the book of Esther, they say, well, this is the miracle that, and there's midrash on this, that Esther actually wasn't that good looking. She wasn't that special, but it was God. And they also have a thing that she didn't sleep with the king. They make it. So they say it was that every night God made an angel sort of be with the king. This is midrash, now it's not in the story. So that he would think that he had had the greatest night of his life with Esther. You know, how was it? Divine. You know, so he makes Esther the new queen. Now arises the wicked Haman. It is a Jewish tradition to this day. There's the Jewish holiday of Purim, which comes in the spring, 30 days before Passover, where they read the book of Esther, and they celebrate the events in Esther. And in it, so they read the whole book out loud, and when they come to the name Haman, the villain of the story, all the kids are allowed to make noise as much as they want in the synagogue. In Israel, the kids use cap guns. And in America, they mostly bang with hammers and noisemakers and all. One year when I was teaching this course, some of my students were on to me. They knew we were going to do Esther that day. And the first time I said the name Haman, suddenly a whole bunch of them started making noise. You know. So you're supposed to drown out his name, the name of the villain. And he is offended by the Jews because he wants everybody to bow down to him, it says. But there's this one guy who won't. And it turns out to be Mordecai, the same guy who had sent Esther to be in the contest. And because he hates Mordecai, it keeps referring to him as Mordecai the Jew, he does what any logical person would do under the circumstances, which is he wants to commit genocide against the man's entire ethnic group. So he decides he's going to kill all the Jews on this certain date. So Mordecai goes to Esther and he says, look, you're the only one, you've got to save us. Now Esther says, well, I can't really go because the king hasn't summoned me for a month now. And you can't go into the king's presence unsummoned. If you do, you're executed. And Mordecai says to her this famous line, if you hold your peace at this time, enlargement and deliverance will arise for the Jews from some other place. And you and your father's house will perish. And who knows if you've come to the monarchy for just such a time as this. That's an important line. That's the closest the book comes to hinting at something about God. It says, if you don't save us, we're going to get saved anyway, but then you'll be in trouble. She goes, oh, okay, then I'll go. So, I mean, she's heroic and yet not heroic. She's going because he told her, no, she has no choice. So then she goes to see the king. And she walks in where you're not permitted to walk into the king unsummoned. And she comes unsummoned, and it says he reaches out his scepter and touches her. I'm a Freudian, what can I say? He reaches out his scepter and touches her with that, and that forgives her. And he says, Esther, why did you come and risk your life to come in here unsummoned to see me? And she says, to invite you to a party. And she invites him to this private party in her rooms, and she says, and I want you to bring the prime minister, the vizier, Haman, to come with you. And now Haman's really honored. He's going to be at this private dinner. There's he and the king and the queen. And they come to her room, and she's acting really down. And Ahasuerus says, what's wrong? I'll give you anything up to half of my kingdom. This is just an expression. He's not going to give his wife half of his kingdom. And she says, I'm really sad because someone's trying to kill me. And he says, who's trying to kill you? And she says, that man, the wicked Haman. And the king just loses it. He's furious, and he goes running out of the room. So now you got to picture the scene. People miss this, especially the kids in Sunday school don't quite get what happens next. Haman is left alone in the queen's room. It's her bedroom. It says he throws himself down on the bed beside her, begging her to intercede and get him forgiven. Just then, Ahasuerus has calmed down, and he comes back into the room, and he sees this guy lying on the bed next to his wife. And he says, will he even approach the queen in my own house? Don't we have any gallows on which to hang this man? And someone says, yeah, there's some he built out there for Mordecai. They go, okay. And they hang him on the gallows that he had built for Mordecai. And then the Jews, on the day when they're supposed to all get killed, the king has given that as a decree, and in the Persian Empire, a king can't take back his own decree, so that he decrees that the Jews are allowed to defend themselves, and so they kill a lot of their enemies that day. And then Esther goes to the king, and she says, by the way, I know you got rid of the wicked Haman, but he still has 10 sons. Would you mind killing them too? So they do. You're going, what is the story doing in the Bible? And it is a powerful story of what life is like when the Jews are now in exile, where you are vulnerable, where your fate can depend on the right woman in the right place at the right time. And maybe the hand of God is behind it, maybe not. You can't tell. And you've had this amazing flow now, to me, that's really interesting, that our story began with Eve, it ends with Esther. And I kind of like that since a lot of people have blamed Eve for starting this whole problem, I don't agree with that, but at least I understand that in the end, it is turning to a woman for your salvation. And so I like that the Bible, the story is bookended, and each bookend has a face of a woman on it. The other thing to notice is we've been tracing this presence of God and the role of humans. You're now at a situation where humans really have to completely rise to the situation and save themselves. And the hiddenness of God, that hidden face of God, has happened so completely and utterly that you finally reach this last book where God isn't even mentioned. And so the Bible has profoundly told the story of a world of talking snakes and splitting seas, and God walking in the garden, and incredible closeness and involvement in all, miracles, all of that, to the book of Esther, which is like the world as we know it, where these things are much more a matter of faith than matters of rocks having water coming out of them and snakes talking. And it is profoundly the story of the movement of the world from that fairy tale, Sunday school, miraculous world to the world in which we live.